All right, so you ready for this one? It's another disturbing one. Starting at verse 8. And the child, talking about Isaac, Yitzhak, and the child grew and was weaned. And Avraham held a great feast on the day that Yitzhak was weaned. Now Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Avraham, mocking. Therefore, she said to Avraham, "Drive out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be an heir with my son Yitzhak." The matter distressed Avraham greatly because of his son. But Elohim said to Avraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and your slave woman. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her. For through Yitzhak your descendants shall be named. And of the son of the slave woman I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant." So Avraham got up early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave to Hagar, putting on her shoulder and the boy, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was used up, she left the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, about a bow shot away. For she said, "May I not see the boy die?" And she sat opposite him and raised her voice and wept. Elohim heard the boy crying, and the angel of Elohim called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear, for Elohim has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Get up, lift up the boy, hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then Elohim opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And Elohim was with the boy, and he grew, and he lived in the wilderness and became an archer. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Now it came about at that time that Avimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, spoke to Avraham, saying, "Elohim is with you in all that you do. So now swear to me here by Elohim that you will not deal falsely with me or with my offspring or with my descendants, but according to the chesed that I have shown to you, you shall show to me and to the land in which you have resided." Avraham said, "I swear it." But Avraham complained to Avimelech because of the well of water which the servants of Avimelech had seized. And Avimelech said, "I don't know who's done this thing. You didn't tell me, nor did I hear of it till today." So Avraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Avimelech. And the two of them made a covenant. But Avraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Then Avimelech said to Avraham, "What do these 7 ewe lambs mean, which you have set by themselves?" And he said, You shall take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, so that it may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore he called that place Beer-sheva. And Avimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, got up and returned to the land of the Philistines, planted a tamarisk tree at Beer-sheva. And there he called on the name of Yahweh, the everlasting God. And Avraham resided in the land of the Philistines for many days. What do these stories have to do with each other? Everything. These 2 stories are so linked, and they're also linked to a couple of stories prior and to the next story, which, by the way, is a big one. Next week, it's a big one. It's the big one. Next week is the Abraham story. I beg of you, don't miss next week. You can invite people if people haven't been in a while. This is what we've all been leading up to, is next week. And there's some amazing cool stuff after it too, but next week is the big one. Okay, last week, this is just the previous page on the scroll, if you will, we had an Avimelech story, if you recall. So it's probably not in chronological order. The incident we read about and studied last week may have been at any time during Avraham and Sarah's sojourn in the Promised Land. It doesn't say that chronologically it goes right there, but it's there for a reason literarily, and it's because it links with this story with something in between. It's very important. And in that story, Avraham used his wife, Sarah, as a shield to protect himself. And so in so doing, he was endangering her virtue, and he's also, therefore, endangering the Promised Land and this misguided attempt to protect it. In other words, he figures, I'm protecting myself because I'm the one that the seed is coming from, so at all costs, I've got to live, even if Sarah maybe is endangered because of it. And he uses this partial deception. And because of his partial deception, not telling Avimelech everything that there is to the story, he put Avimelech's life and the life of his whole nation at risk because no one was bearing children. No one was conceiving in that land. He brought a curse on Avimelech. Yahweh actually is like, all right, Yahweh doesn't normally do things this way, but in this instance, he stepped in personally and intervened on the pagan king's behalf. It's so cool. And Avraham, he sort of half comes clean. But this was an example of Avraham dealing falsely in such a way that the bad part of the promises in Genesis 12, which is whoever curses you, they will be cursed. Well, Avimelech didn't even know he was cursing Avraham. He was ignorant of it, but curses were coming upon his people because of his unwitting mistreatment of Avraham and Sarah. So that was last week. So now we have a second incident regarding Avimelech and his people. And these 2 stories are like bookends for this mini literary unit here. Avimelech wants to get an oath out of Avraham that he's not going to deal falsely. Now, why would he want that kind of an oath? Because of that other story, right? Almost destroyed him and his nation. So he's like, look, I remember that thing that happened however long ago, but rather than just swearing an oath, Avraham uses this opportunity to make a covenant sacrifice of worship. And between these 2 bookended stories, which are related to each other, there are central narratives. Last week, you saw me kind of lose it when we talked about how the promise is actually fulfilled in Sarah. It's just a huge, amazing twist to the story. I'm sorry about that. That was embarrassing. I lost it. But now Sarah, she is enduring her own struggle with oppressing a foreigner, in this case an Egyptian immigrant and her son, and this competing claim to the inheritance and to the blessings. So how does this look if we kind of color code it? I know this isn't a chiasm exactly, it's a different structure It's an A-B structure. But we saw in chapter 20 that blessed Abraham, he's been very blessed by God. Well, now this man who has been so blessed brings hardship to a Gentile king because he wants to protect himself. So Yahweh intervenes on behalf of the oppressed, even though he's a Gentile king. And then we have how Sarah is blessed. She is blessed with being the vehicle of the promise coming true. Really, the story is much more about her than anyone would have thought. And here she brings hardship to a foreign slave because she wants to protect her lineage. See, Abraham wanted to protect his person. She wants to protect her lineage. So what does Yahweh do? He intervenes on behalf of the oppressed. We read that in the story. Now we go back to Avimelech. So that's A, B, now A. Yes, Yahweh intervened on behalf of the pagan king, but we still have Abraham and his dealing falsely that has to be dealt with. God has loved the pagan king, but Abraham has to make things right with him. So his unrighteousness towards Avimelech is resolved through covenant sacrifice. We're not going to get a resolution this week to Sarah's unrighteousness towards Hagar and Ishmael. That is next week. Okay, verse 8, let's go verse by verse. And the child, Yeled is the Hebrew word, keep that in mind. And the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham held a great feast on that day that Yitzhak, which means laughter, remember, was weaned. So in the ancient Near East, weaning typically took place at 3 years old. It was considered a mark of health, success. For a child to survive at that age, infant mortality was just, in the ancient, classical, even up to modern times, really, was huge. Many children did not make it to 3 years old. So this is a big deal. This is a cause for celebration. Verse 9, now Sarah saw, this is a bunch of seeing stuff is in this chapter. She saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, Metzak. He was Yitzhaking. Now, the New American Standard has, so this is a very ambiguous thing here. What does that mean, he was laughing? Was he mocking? The NASB translators have taken that interpretive route. Others will simply say he was laughing. Some say he was playing with Yitzhak. The name Yitzhak is not actually in that verse. It's just, here is Ishmael, Sakak. He's laughing. So it's an ambiguity. So first of all, Sarah saw, we're seeing this incident in this verse through Sarah's eyes. The Moses team is not interested, and we want to know what exactly is going on here that got her so upset. And the Moses writing team has no interest in explaining it to us. It's just they're not interested in explaining. They just want us to see this word laughter. And the reason, whether it's laughing at him or laughing with him or whatever, is intentionally, strategically ambiguous for a couple of reasons. One is the focus is on the wordplay. She sees Yitzhak in Ishmael, but no. That reminds her of her son, Yitzhak. You see what I'm saying here? Something about his laughter or whatever it is that he's doing reminds her that, he's a co-heir at least with my son, and we cannot have that. So and one of the reasons that biblical authors leave these intentional ambiguities is to cause people to ask the very questions we ask, which is, what exactly is going on here? Which causes us to go back to the text and meditate on it and think about it and talk about it with each other and have conversations and try to figure it out. It's a little magnet bringing our minds back to this passage. I know you're like, why would they do that to us? It's so frustrating. But to them, it is a very intentional strategy to get us to look at the whole story here. So this activity of laughter triggers this envious response in laughter's mom. Verse 10. Therefore she said to Avraham, drive out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be an heir with my son Yitzhak. If you recall a few pages ago, whose idea was it in the first place? Yeah, Sarah, it was her idea to have Avraham have a son, hopefully by Hagar. So so technically, according to the customs of the ancient Near East, Ishmael is the son of Avraham and Sarah. But she does not see it that way. This is the slave woman's son. It's no son of mine. So if you recall, as soon as Ishmael was born, and Hagar started thinking, you know what? You couldn't have a child, but I did. You know, it was kind of, she was looking at Sarah differently. And Sarah responded by just mistreating her horribly. And Hagar ran away, basically exiled herself. It's a type of suicide. And what happened? Yahweh intervened and saw her. And she's like, you're the God who sees me. If you recall, this is a big moment. Yahweh says, no, go back. I've got a plan for you. And he promised Avraham at one point that Ishmael would become a great nation. So here is this ancient ironclad law, the rule of, not a law in the books per se, because there wasn't really any such thing at this time, but this rule of ancient Near Eastern society is, it's the ironclad law of primogeniture, which means firstborn son is that's the deal. Firstborn son gets the inheritance. Firstborn son gets everything. At the very least, we have this other son by the actual wife, and the firstborn is by a concubine. At the very least, they get equal share. And Sarah wants none of that. So notice that when she talks, she doesn't say Hagar or Ishmael. She just impersonalizes them with this slave woman and her son. So what Sarah wants is for Avraham to garash, to drive them out. And it's interesting because this word, garash, has only been used in the Bible up to this point. It's only been used 2 other times up to this point. And that's when Yahweh garashed or drove out Adam from the garden in chapter 3, verse 24. Second time was when Cain complains that his expulsion from Eden meant that Yahweh had driven him out, garash. So this is exile language. She is asking Avraham to exile them. And the Bible has already narratively kind of set on analogy exile and death. Exile is a type of death, and death is a type of exile. They relate to each other like parallel ideas, although there's some distinctions. So Sarah is commanding an exile so that, as far as the family goes, they'll be dead. Verse 11, the matter distressed Avraham greatly because of his son. So the word that's used here in Hebrew for distressed, whenever that's used in the whole Hebrew Bible, it's associated with anger. It's associated with a violent reaction. Whenever it's used with relationship to Yahweh, death usually follows of some kind. So this is a big word. And this is the only time greatly distressed is used in the whole Hebrew Bible. Distressed is used, and it's violent anger. This is the only time that greatly distressed is used. So don't think, oh, man, I'm just distressed over this. Think an incredible outburst on Avraham's part. Have you ever seen somebody that just lost it in anger? lost it. This is the idea that the biblical authors are trying to get across here. It kind of changes the character of the story a little bit, doesn't it? So here he is, doing whatever he's doing, throwing pots and pans around and slamming tent flaps. But Elohim said to Avraham, do not be distressed. The NASB translators are some of the most amazing translation team of all biblical teams. But they got this one wrong because the word distressed here is a totally different phrase. Literally in Hebrew, it is, do not let this be displeasing in your eyes, is what the actual Hebrew phrase is. It's a seeing thing. Do not see it this way, is basically what Elohim is saying. Change your lens because of the boy and your slave woman. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her. For through Yitzhak your descendants shall be named. And the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation also, because he's your descendant. So Elohim is not endorsing Sarah's motives at all, but he's assuring Abraham that he's going to look after Ishmael, even though the promise, the chosen promise, if you will, is to Yitzhak. Let it not be displeasing in your sight, which is the literal phrase, not just don't be greatly distressed. Elohim is saying to Avraham, shift how you're looking at this whole thing. What Sarah has said, listen to her. So said is the word kol in Hebrew. Listen is shema. So listen to the voice of your wife is a thing in Scripture that so far has been associated with very negative things. In chapter 16, Avraham shema to Sarai's kol, and it resulted in the unauthorized birth of Ishmael because he listened to the voice of his wife. When Yahweh Elohim relayed the lamentable consequences of the big fail to Adam back in Genesis 3, the whole thing with the tree, it was because, according to Yahweh, Adam shemad to the kol of his wife. So this is a phrase that Bible nerds, if you're reading in Hebrew, you're like, I've heard this before. Avraham has learned the lesson, and so has the Torah reader, that if the voice of the wife is coming from a bad place, don't shema. Don't shema. And to him, what amounts to a death sentence to his son seems like pretty bad advice. Please don't blame Avraham for freaking out. And then Yahweh intervenes. He steps in to explain. He said, look, the name, or that's a kind of a code word for election or chosenness, will be through Yitzhak. Remember what election is for, chosenness is for? We learned in chapter 12, like the first week or two of this class. It's so that you, the chosen one, will be the conduit of blessing to the non-chosen. That's the purpose of being chosen. It's not to hoard the blessing, but to be like the channel of blessing. So that's Yitzhak's place. He's going to be the channel of blessing. And it is Elohim's, God's will, that Ishmael will also become a great nation. So according to the chapter 12, verses 1 through 6 promise, that means his purpose is to be a recipient of the blessing that is, or his descendants, through the blessing that comes through the descendants of Yitzhak. That is the point of the whole chosen story of the Bible. And it gets played out in positive and negative ways all through the Hebrew Bible. And ultimately, it is through this chosen seed that we find in Genesis chapter 3 of the snake crusher, the one who crushes the serpent's head, that all this blessing is played out because it's the snake crusher who is the chosen one. Now, does the snake crusher, the chosen one, the Messiah, keep all that blessing to himself? No, he doesn't. He absolutely, his purpose is to take that blessing and share it with others. And the cool thing, I'm going on a rant. This isn't in the notes. The cool thing that in the New Testament, what is seen, the eyes unveiled, is that, wait a minute, what the Messiah did was invited everyone who he blesses into himself. Even if they're not Jewish. He's combining the families of the earth again into himself. So that now, how do you know you're chosen? Because you're in the chosen one. You're in Christ. And so what's your role as one who is in Christ? To be a conduit of blessing to others. It's so cool. Anyway, little rant. So the point is that, don't fall into the trap of thinking, well, this person or this people group or whatever, they're descended from this bad actor. So they can't be part of, the chosen ones. That is not Jesus thinking at all. They are actually picked out, if you will, to be the recipients of blessing, which Jesus provided. And now invited to be a part of Jesus himself, to be in Christ, as Paul repeatedly says, which means they have joined the elect. And now they too can be a blessing to other people. Don't buy into the idea that just because someone's of a certain lineage that they can't be in. That's such falsehood. Verse 14. So, this is a phrase you should circle. I know everything's important. Verse 14. So Abraham got up early in the morning. Put a pin in this, because next week, this is the line that links this story and the story we're getting next week. Okay. And he took bread and a skin of water and gave to Hagar, putting on her shoulder. So all of a sudden we've slowed down. Now we've got him taking bread, taking a skin of water. We're giving them to Hagar, put on her shoulder. This is unusual slowdown of pace in biblical literature. And when that happens, it's for emotional impact, partly, so that we can feel the plodding agony of Abraham, who may have gotten up early because he couldn't sleep. And it's like every step, you're supposed to it's stretching it out so you feel this. This isn't glossing over this incident. It wants you to take note of it. So the bread and a skin of water, in the ancient Near East, this is a custom of whenever you free a slave, you do that. You have a skin of water and bread. It's a symbolic gesture of freedom. So this is kind of ironic that in sending this woman and her young son into the wilderness with nothing but, a skin of water and bread, it's also like an emancipation. It's so bittersweet. And she shoulders it. So it's no longer Abraham's responsibility to shoulder her provision, it's hers. So this also means, as he's sending them away and freeing them, that Ishmael is disinherited. So granting freedom and basically getting rid of your son. Do you see why he was so distressed? And he gave her the boy and sent her away. So the very last thing that he gives her all this stuff, but he's holding onto the boy until the last minute. And now the phraseology in Hebrew is almost like he puts the boy on her shoulder, which obviously literally he didn't do. But the idea is to be thinking, not only is the provision her responsibility, but now the boy is fully hers. He's not Abraham's anymore. And now this mom, this lifelong slave, single mother, she's being sent into the wilderness alone with this kid. And boy is the same word as was used for Yitzhak. It is weaning, it's yeled. And it's a word that can encompass anybody from 3 years old to their teens. There's a controversy about how old Ishmael was. I think there's a coping strategy to say, you know, this guy, maybe he was 18 years old, and he was mocking or doing something terrible to Yitzhak, and he deserved this. And that's not the point here. It's not the point of this passage. The passage is just pulling us right into the mess of this and how awful that it is. It is not glossing it over with different coping strategies. That's why it uses the same word for boy. So it complicates this view that exile is allowable because Yitzhak, he's just an innocent babe. Well, Ishmael is this mocker of an older teenager. We all know how teenagers can be mocking. He probably deserved it. This narrative is promoting a complex and nuanced meditation that somehow Sarah's sin, which is what it is, and Yahweh's redemptive plan for Ishmael, but also for the world, have been brought into alignment. How is that possible? Yahweh Elohim will not prevent Sarah from sinning. He's not going to prevent her from sinning. Nor is he going to allow it to go without generational consequences, because it does have generational consequences to this day, but also just within the story of Genesis itself, because Abraham and Sarah's great-grandson is going to be oppressed by Ishmaelites at the end of Genesis. It actually happens. So all of that, yes, sin happens, consequences happen throughout generations, but Yahweh will redeem this. He will redeem this. He doesn't stop people from doing evil things, usually, but he will redeem it. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Be'er Sheva. So water and food in the wilderness, I don't know if you know this, there's not a fast food place around, every few rocks. There's no food, very little food, very little water. She's lost. And she's in the wilderness. And wilderness is used in the Hebrew Bible as a picture of uninhabitable chaos. Just like the ocean or the sea is a picture of primordial chaos. It's an image of non-existence. On land, wilderness kind of fulfills the same function in the ancient Israelite mind. So when the water in the skin was used up, she left the boy under one of the bushes. And she went, sat down opposite him, about a bow shot away. Why this information? For she said, "May I not see the boy die?" And she sat opposite him and raised her voice and wept. So her whole life's work now fits into a canteen, essentially. And that's gone. She's got nothing. And she puts the boy under a bush. This should activate, wait a minute, trees, bushes. And in Hebrew, this is a different word than tree. But anything related to plant life and trees and so forth is all kind of related. So this is, you're supposed to be thinking there's some sort of symbolism with this. Any time you go near a plant big enough to sit under, there's a metaphor, there's an underlying metaphor here, because trees and humans are linked in the creation story. They both happen on the same day. So something is happening here that we need to pay attention to. And she is a bow shot away. Now, bow and bow shot should also activate something in the mind of the careful Torah readers. The last time we saw something about bows, and it's the same word in Hebrew as in English for like bow and arrow, was the rainbow, so that was like a covenant sign of some kind. So is Yahweh getting ready to do something here? And so, may I not see? So she's asking for a removal of vision. In the last story where she was out in the wilderness of her own accord, Yahweh Elohim saw her, and she called that out. Now she's like, I don't want to see. I don't want to see what's about to happen. So she's basically asking for a miracle. And maybe her own weeping or drowning out the boy's anguished cries. She says, I won't hear it if I cry loud enough. But Elohim heard the boy crying. Remember what the name Ishmael means? It means God has heard, which she came up with that name when she was out in the wilderness. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Get up, number one. Number two, lift up the boy. Number three, hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him. So this is a second angelic appearance that is associated with God to one person in the Bible. That is very rare in the Bible. Very rare do people get more than one such appearance. Just interesting. Yahweh has shamad, or heard, the chol, the voice. Just like he said to Abraham, listen to the voice of your wife. Now he has heard the voice of this exiled son, right where he is, under a bush. And he gives Hagar 3 commands. First of all, get up, which is the Hebrew word kum. And this is a word that is used all over the flood narrative. When Noah was, for God establishing his covenant before the flood and after the flood, there's all kinds of kums used there. And here it is being used for Hagar. So it's connecting with some sort of rescue plan, which is what the flood narrative is. And then lift up, nasa. So Yahweh, he lifted up the ark in Genesis 7:17. Oh, and hold him by the hand. This is chazak. And this is the exact thing. It's supposed to be precise. I missed the E, sorry. The exact thing that the angelic beings did to Lot to rescue him from the flood of fire. So this is rescue language. Then Elohim opened her eyes. Remember she said, I don't want to see? He's like, no, you're going to see. And lo and behold, what's there? It's a well of water. Now, the idea here is biblical authors are not trying to claim that suddenly a well miraculously appeared out of nowhere, but that she could not see it. She couldn't see the well that was already there. And so what does she do? She goes and she fills the skin with water and gives the boy a drink. So notice how Elohim opened her eyes. And the authors are making a point here in conjunction with other seeing phrases throughout the Abraham story. Do not see what seems. Whether it seems tov, good, like Lot seeing the lush Jordan River basin, seemed good to him. That's what he saw. Don't use your own vision and what seems to you for what is bad or raw. Like Hagar, she's here, she's seeing raw. She's seeing a hopeless situation where she fears seeing her boy die. Because when you see with your own way of seeing things, that's trying to grasp the knowledge of good and evil for ourselves and in our own terms. Let Yahweh open your eyes. See through his lenses. And when she did, or when he did for her, she sees this well of water, which was there the whole time. In biblical narratives, as we're going to see shortly, a well is where a woman, when there's a woman and a well together in a biblical narrative, it's almost always a courtship scene, usually leading to marriage. So this is a covenant promise to this woman that her family will be great. She filled the skin with water, gave the boy a drink. Ishmael's cry to God initiated God opening Hagar's eyes. And then she gave the drink to Ishmael. Why didn't God just fill the water skin miraculously and, float it over to Ishmael and then pour it down his mouth? Or just create water inside of him? Because his preferred method of working with people is through people. That's why Hagar went to the well, filled this. It seems intuitive, but a lot of times we say, why did God use all these people that are so flawed? And why didn't he just go in there and take care of it himself? He will sometimes, but it's so rare because it's not what he wants. He wants to work through people. That's his passion. Okay, it's like a sacred partnership. That's the whole point of being his image. It's not this that, God's creative and we're creative, although it's there too, or we image him, character-wise or whatever. It's more than that. An image is like a deputy. And he's like, what I want with this world, I want to do through my imagers. Verse 20, and Elohim was with the boy, and he grew, and he lived in the wilderness and became an archer. There's that bow language again. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife from him from the land of Egypt. So having thus saved Ishmael's life, is God going to abandon Ishmael, even though he's going to become a wild donkey of a man, like we learned in chapter 16? Yahweh's love is faithful, emet. It's faithful, it's true. And it says he became an archer, which is just such a word play on Hagar weeping within bowshot and the bow in the skies in Genesis 9. Ishmael has been given an oath or a mark of grace, and it's this bow. In chapter 16, Yahweh told Hagar that Ishmael would be a pareh, or wild donkey. And now Ishmael lives in the wilderness of Paran. This is a visual wordplay. And he gets a wife from Egypt. Hagar apparently did not return to Egypt. She stayed in this region that Yahweh had provided. Yet Hagar found a wife for her son from their familial homeland. Would there be some foreshadowing going on here? Perhaps. Okay. Walter Brueggemann says, the text here is unambiguous. Isaac is the child of promise. That much is not in doubt. The narrative knows the canonical story must be presented. And that story is an Isaac story. But the text is equally clear that God is well inclined toward Ishmael. The other son is not to be dismissed from the family. The narrative holds us to the tension found so often in this narrative, the tension between the one elected and the not elected one who is treasured. It is, of course, evident that Ishmael's promise is short of the full promise given to Isaac. And yet it is a considerable promise, not to be denied. God is attentive to the outsider. God will remember all the children like a mother remembers all her children. Okay, so now we've got this well covenant. In other words, there's a well, and there's satisfaction of thirst in Be'er Sheva between Hagar, the immigrant, and Yahweh. In Be'er Sheva between Abraham, the immigrant, there's going to be another covenant by a well, and Avimelech, the king of Gerar. So just like in the second Avimelech story, which we're about to look at, it's a bookend with the inheritance and promised line stories sandwiched in between. So let's look at this Avimelech story, verse 22. It came about at that time that Avimelech and Phicol, the commander of his armies, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do, so now swear to me here by Elohim that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my offspring, or with my descendants, but according to the chesed that I have shown to you, you shall show to me and to the land in which you have resided. So here is this pagan king recognizing the favor of Elohim upon Abraham. But he's been burned badly in the past by Abraham's previous deception. So Avimelech requests, rather than getting the me be cursed because I curse you part of the promise, he requests, I've been blessing you, so you let me be blessed part. So Avimelech, he's claiming here to have shown Abraham chesed. There is no real translation for this word in English. Chesed is one of Yahweh himself's character traits that he says about himself in Exodus. So it's a big word, very big word. And we don't have a word for it in English. It means kindness, it means mercy, it means love, it means loyalty. The King James translators just invented a brand new word for it when they translated, called loving kindness. It's like a word that didn't exist, but they're like, what are we going to do here? We'll just put two words together. They're so cool. But it's a big, big word. The book of Ruth the whole book is about chesed. It's an exposition on this word. But here, Avimelech is claiming, this is what I've shown you, so you should show it to me. And he asks the same. And not just to him, but also to the Edits, to the land, which isn't his, but where he's sojourned. And it's that word gur, which is connected to Hagar. So you see the wordplay that's going on here, connecting these stories. The Moses team is drawing this literary parallel between Avraham as immigrant and Hagar as immigrant through these repeated words, but also through the pattern of the story. Let's see where it goes. Avraham says, I swear it. I shavah. I make the oath. Shavah is oath. And he agrees. I'm going to show the chesed that Avimelech has shown. But Avimelech, this chesed that you talk about showing me, there's a problem. Verse 25. Avraham complained to Avimelech because of the well of water, which the servants of Avimelech had seized. And Avimelech said, I don't know who's done this. You didn't tell me. I didn't hear of it till today. So Avimelech's men have done Avraham wrong by taking a well that he dug. So Avraham, the immigrant, doesn't have enough water. Does that sound familiar? The immigrant doesn't have enough water. Okay, this is the last story. Avimelech, now this is what's in Avimelech's mind. Oh no, I've done something else wrong that I didn't even know. What curse is going to come upon me? That's why he's like, he's pretty upset in his response because he remembers the last time he did something that he had no idea was wrong. Curses came upon him and his people, and Yahweh said, you're a dead man. So he's like, he doesn't want to be any part of this. And what upset him was that Avraham didn't tell him the truth. So he's like, you should have told me because maybe I'll die for this thing that I didn't even know about. So Avraham here is doing the right thing by coming clean, by telling him what happened here. And so what happens is they make a berit, they make a covenant. And this is the same word that's used between Yahweh and Noah. In fact, in Genesis 9, the word berit or covenant is used 7 times. And here is Avraham and this pagan king making things right between themselves. But then Avraham, he set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Then Avimelech said to Avraham, what do these 7 ewe lambs mean, which you have set by themselves? And he said, you shall take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand so that it may be a witness for me that I dug this well. So this is a brilliant literary move by the Holy Spirit-inspired authors. Avimelech's question, what do these 7 mean? They record this conversation and this part of the conversation so that we can ask as a reader, what is 7 ewe lambs supposed to mean? And it's a clue to what covenants of 7 in the whole Bible mean. It's a gift of testimony to the work of the covenant maker. So we were just given, like first mention in the Bible of a covenant of 7, we were just given here's your code. Anytime there's a covenant of 7 anywhere in the Bible, that's what it means. It's a gift of testimony to the work of the one who's making the covenant. And there's also wordplay, of course. 7 in Hebrew is sheva, and oath is shava. They look exactly the same. Well, not exactly. They're very close to the same. There's one extra Hebrew letter in Shava. But visually, you're reading and you're like, Shava, Shava, I see what you did there. So he called the place Be'er Sheva, because there the two of them took a Shava. So, there you go. Verse 32. So they made a covenant at Be'er Sheva, and Avimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, got up, returned to the land of the Philistines. So, this was not written in the days of Abraham. This was written hundreds and hundreds of years later, at the earliest, by Moses and his writing team. In Moses' day, there were Philistines in that land. In Abraham's day, there were not Philistines in that land. So that's why he says at the time there are no Philistines there. Or, but it's the land of what is now, in Moses' time, of the Philistines. You get what I'm saying? He's just trying to give a geographical marker. Like if I say, oh, the Byzantine Empire in, the 1100s was in Turkey. Well, Turkey didn't exist in the 1100s, but it's in the same region. That's what the biblical authors are saying here. And Abraham planted a tamarisk tree at Be'er Sheva, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. So here's a tree again. Remember there was that bush that Ishmael was under? And here right after this covenant, there's a tree that's planted. Trees and similar plants, they just tend to go together with God's plan imagistically, a whole bunch in these types of stories. So note to reader, when you see a tree, log, stick, branch, wood, which there's one Hebrew word for all those things, and that's eitz. So it's stick and tree, it's like the same word, it's eitz. Or a bush, which is a different word. But when you see that kind of thing in the biblical narratives, we're being trained by the authors to be on the alert for a covenant occurring. So for example, next week, if something is highlighted that is the word eitz, that might be a clue to us that there's a covenant in the making. Just in case that word exists next week in chapter 22. I'm not saying it does. I don't want to spoil it. And he called on the name of the Lord. It might be a sacrifice here, but the focus is the planting of the tree. The tree, the sacrifice, the covenant, and these concepts should be overlapping in the minds of the reader through the instruction of the story, the Torah of the story. And Abraham resided in the land of the Philistines for many days. So Abraham is now at peace with the people who are living in the land that are inhabited in the future by the Philistines. He did right by them. So he's not a Samson character. Samson, one day we'll study Judges, unfortunately. I love the book of Judges, but a lot of people are going to be very disturbed by Judges. I think it's a wonderful story, though. But Samson is not a hero. He is, at best, an anti-hero. And he doesn't do right by his neighbors, and there's all sorts of major, major issues. But Abraham, here he is making things right with his neighbors that don't even think the same way. He's not part of the same culture as him. And remember what Hagar means. It means immigrant. She was an Egyptian. She's a foreigner. She's an alien in Abraham's household. And she was, maybe unwillingly, made a participant into a let's see to this thing ourselves plan of Sarah and Abraham to produce an heir. She was oppressed in chapter 16, and finally she was exiled. However, after Hagar left her son by a bush, Yahweh used the lack of water in Be'er Sheva to covenant with her by providing a well. This story, Abraham is an immigrant in Canaan, an Aramean, and thus a foreigner in Avimelech's territory. And he made Sarah into a participant into a see-it-ourselves plan to protect Abraham's life and his ability to produce an heir by deceiving Avimelech in the previous story with him at Sarah's expense. And Sarah was vindicated, but Avimelech's men keep stripping Abraham of water. Before planting a tree, the lack of water leads to a covenant of 7, Be'er Sheva, and provides a well to Avraham. You see how these stories are set on analogy to each other? I know it's deep, but it's intentionally deep. Okay, first audience, what are they thinking? They're like, okay, we've got a lot to learn about the way that the Moses team is representing Yahweh's faithfulness to the elect, his faithfulness to the wayward, his faithfulness to the immigrant, his faithfulness to the nations, his faithfulness to children that aren't even born yet. Whoa. And Yahweh Elohim, even though he's perfectly capable of carrying out his plans all by his lonesome, he almost never does. He repeatedly, consistently carries out his plans by means of repeatedly inconsistent human beings. And how are the Israelites to see those wilderness seasons where Yahweh provides water? As covenant type scenes, almost like marriage scenes. They're in the wilderness, wandering around in the desert, and Yahweh provides water for them. And then how are Israelites supposed to do right by their neighbors? Just something to meditate on. What about us? How do we reflect? Is God's care and his chesed for the non-elect, Hagar, Ishmael, Avimelech, is that portrayed by the Moses team any differently than God's care and chesed for the elect? Do they get short shrift? He saves them all, doesn't he? Do you think that there's a possibility that someday in the future, Yahweh intends to join these two streams together by quenching eternal thirst, a tree, a sacrifice, and chesed? I think that's where the story is leading. And who in these stories has modeled perfect righteousness or perfect doing right by others in these stories? It's only Yahweh. I'm answering that. Can we trust God even when we can't see? Okay, so I'm interested in any insights that our folks at the table might have. And we might have to save questions for a future week, which you'll be glad to know that the last week of class, it's all questions and response. So be saving up your questions. And it could be anything in the Bible. So, thoughts?
So when I read this story this morning and in the past, I always hated that God allowed the bad things to happen to Hagar. She was innocent in all of this. So to assume, right?
Yeah.
And I never saw God taking care of her as still like blessing her and caring for her and loving her. And so what you just said about who's modeled perfect righteousness, doing right by others in these stories, can we trust God even when we cannot see? I was like, it was just like a whole in my brain of like, oh wow, he allows the consequences of the sin to happen sometimes, but he does the taking caring and the loving and seeing us. That's the thing that like has really just stood out to me in this whole story. Because I just hated all the bad things that were just happening, right? The poor choices that were being made and all that jazz. So, so that's what I just really took away from this tonight.
That's good. That's very good.
The part that I look at always is Abraham's lack of foresight. He swings in with everybody, does everything with everybody, and then at the end of the day ends up being the father of both nations. So when you look at Abraham and they sing the song Father Abraham, it was both nations. And I think often we tend to look at only the Jewish side of it, and old Ishmael just about disappears into the past. Well, he goes into the wilderness. And I read a commentation where God had actually said to him, had said to Hagar that he would be a wild man, and gave several instances or characteristics of the wild man that would play out. So if we look at it, there was never any making right with either side. And that goes on today.
Yeah, so, yeah, I want to take 10 minutes to talk about the making right, but I'm not. I will say this, though. This is another spoiler alert, as we will find at the end of our classes. You may be surprised, some of you, to learn that Yitzhak and Ishmael are not the only biological children of Avraham, actual biological children of Avraham. Believe it or not, there are more, and we're going to study that. Okay,